Hi, it's good to be with you. When we talk about dessert custards, creme brulee, creme caramel, pastry cream come to mind. There are also savory custards. Think about quiche. All of these items have a few things in common. They are dairy liquids that are seasoned, either sweet or savory, and thickened either with eggs and egg yolks or starch, or eggs and starch. When we make pastry cream, we use eggs, egg yolks, and cornstarch. When we make creme brulee and creme caramel, the thickening agents are the eggs. Tonight I want to show you a dessert, one of my favorites, panna cotta, which is a dairy liquid that is flavored, thickened with gelatin. The gelatin we're going to use tonight is going to be unflavored granulated gelatin. And understanding gelatin is key to making this and any other dessert with gelatin. When you work with granulated gelatin, there are two concepts you have to keep in mind for success. First, you have to work with a recipe that works. It's got the right amount of gelatin and the right amount of liquid in it. You've got to have a reliable recipe. The second thing you have to keep in mind is you have to very accurately measure the gelatin. You might have a recipe that works. If you over measure the gelatin, the resulting product will be too stiff. If you under measure the gelatin, the resulting product won't set properly. When you work with granulated gelatin, there are generally two steps that are employed. First, because granulated gelatin is very coarse, it's like fine-grained sand, you've got to soften that gelatin in some liquid. For an example today, to show you how this works, I'm going to take some of this granulated gelatin and I'm going to soften it in some water. This is called blooming. And the way you do that is by sprinkling the gelatin over the liquid. Could be water, could be milk, could be wine, could be spirits. But you want to make sure that you're not mounding that gelatin all in one pile, like an anthill. You want to have that liquid available to soften that gelatin. This is going to sit for a few more minutes, and what's going to happen is that liquid is going to soften those crystals of gelatin. It'll become spongy in texture. This is a step that you can do in advance. The next step, when this has fully softened, is to melt that gelatin. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to take this container with softened gelatin, we're going to put it in a water bath, and we're going to melt it. That will turn this spongy combination of water and gelatin into a liquid. That liquid can then be poured into something that we want to thicken. It's been a few minutes, and all of the liquid has softened the granulated gelatin that we put on top of it. This gelatin is now considered bloomed, and it's got a very spongy texture to it. One very important factor when you're adding gelatin, crystal gelatin, to a liquid for blooming is you want to make sure that all of the gelatin is exposed to the liquid. You don't want it anthill, and you don't want any dried gelatin crystals outside of the liquid. If that happens, you end up with coarse sand-like gelatin in the finished product. Not a good thing. I'm going to take this gelatin and I'm going to bring it over to the stove where I've got a simmering water bath going. I'm going to place this in the pan with the simmering water, and this is going to melt. It's going to melt into a slightly yellow, light amber colored liquid, which if I was going to thicken something, I would pour into that liquid and it would set overnight. For this purpose, I'm going to melt that gelatin and then just let it cool. And when it's cool and set, be able to take that disc out and it'll be floppy and firm. Let's see what it looks like. Okay, we're at the stove. We've got a pan of simmering water. There's our bloomed gelatin. In the background, we've got a pan with some heavy cream and sugar in it. There's some additional heavy cream, and there are the flavoring agents for the panna cotta we're going to make. It'll be a bittersweet espresso panna cotta, and in that container there's bittersweet chocolate, cocoa powder, and some espresso powder. So let's take the container of bloomed gelatin, set it in that pan of simmering water, and in a few minutes that bloomed gelatin will turn into a liquid, which will then either thicken another liquid or set up as a gelatinous disc. The gelatin has melted, and what I'm going to do is take that gelatin and pour it into this stainless steel bowl and allow it to cool. And when it's cool, be able to take out a floppy disc of gelatin. So, we've seen blooming, we've seen melting, and now the gelatin is going to set. With your newfound understanding of granulated gelatin, let's talk about the procedure for making this bittersweet espresso chocolate panna cotta. First thing we're going to do is we're going to bloom some gelatin in some milk. So this is exactly the same procedure we used before in my little example with water. Notice that I'm not creating an anthill and all of the gelatin is exposed to the liquid. We'll let this sit for 5 or so minutes until that milk softens up that gelatin. In the meantime, we're going to take the first measure of heavy cream with sugar in it, bring that over to the stove and heat it over a low heat until the sugar dissolves. Once that happens, we're going to take our bittersweet chocolate, cocoa powder, and espresso powder, add that to the hot cream and sugar mixture, stir to dissolve until it's very smooth. We're going to add in some additional heavy cream, make sure it's nice and smooth, and by that time this gelatin will have bloomed. What we'll do then is take this bloomed gelatin and put it into the hot liquid. This is a shortcut step. In the previous example, we bloomed, then melted, and then typically would pour the melted gelatin into something else. In this case, we're using the hot cream to melt the gelatin. Once all of these components are together, of course we'll add in a little bit of vanilla, we'll pour it into the desired containers. Could be champagne glasses, could be any type of ramekin, any type of decorative dish that you want to pour the dessert into. Put it in the refrigerator, let it set up overnight, and then serve it the next day. The first measure of cream and sugar are warm and melted. I'm going to take the bittersweet chocolate, the cocoa powder, and the espresso powder. Add that in. Begin to stir to dissolve. I'm going to bring this back to the stove, melt it, and when this is completely melted, I'm going to add in the remaining cream. And by that time, our gelatin should be properly bloomed. This should be properly hot. The bloomed gelatin will go into here. Vanilla goes in. Stir to combine. Pour it into glasses. Refrigerate. Perfectly smooth. First measure of cream, sugar, bittersweet chocolate, cocoa powder, and espresso powder. In goes the remaining cream. I've said this before, these silicone spatulas are amazing. They get everything out of a container. So I'm stirring this together. I'm going to bring it back to the stove, get it uniform, get it warm, and when I come back, I'm going to take this bloomed gelatin and put it in here, and then portion it. Alright, the additional cream has been added. This chocolate and cream mixture is completely smooth, and into this I'm going to put the bloomed gelatin, making sure I get all of it out. In goes the vanilla. Let's stir that around to make sure it's nice and uniform. We'll get everything off the sides. This smells so good. Heat melts gelatin, cold sets gelatin. So whenever you make a panna cotta, you need to be able to leave enough time for it to properly set. Overnight is good. Several hours works. You just have to take it case by case. Alright, I've poured the panna cotta mixture into a pitcher with a spout. We'll leave a little bit of room for some type of garnish. Panna cotta isn't always chocolate, and you can float or layer different colors of panna cotta in the same glass. There we go. I'll put these in the refrigerator, and tomorrow we'll take a look at them. Alright, the last thing I want to show you is the set gelatin. This is unflavored granular gelatin, which was bloomed, melted, and allowed to set. If we were going to thicken something with this, we would have put this in a liquid state into another liquid to set it. Hopefully it wouldn't turn into this consistency. This is way too rubbery. But again, this is just an example. It's the next day and the panna cotta have set up quite nicely. And what I'd like to do is a basic garnish. I'm a little light on garnish materials. But what I think I'd like to do is create a brulee on top of the panna cotta, and on top of that brulee put some slightly under-whipped, sweetened, flavored with a little chocolate extract, heavy cream. So let's talk about brulee. If you've heard of creme brulee, you know the expression means to burn. And what we're going to do is sprinkle a little bit of sugar on top of those panna cotta. We're going to hit it with a little bit of a blowtorch and caramelize that sugar, making a thin, crisp layer on top of the panna cotta. On top of that, we'll put the slightly under-whipped heavy cream, and that's about the best I can do right now. So, how do we do this? The panna cotta have developed a little bit of condensation on the top, so the first thing I want to do is take a little bit of paper towel and remove as much of that moisture as I can without disturbing the surface of the panna cotta. Okay. I'm going to take some white granulated sugar and evenly sprinkle it over the surface of that panna cotta. Not too thick, not too thin. Now, we're going to use fire, and when you use fire, you have to be a little bit on the careful side. So make sure that there's nothing flammable around. Paper, parchment paper on a sheet tray, things like that. Just keep in mind that it's fire. So, gently move that flame back and forth and all the way around until you start to get a little bit of caramelization. And there you go. It smells a little bit like toasted marshmallows, in this case with a little bit of chocolate thrown in. We're going to let that cool for just a little bit, and you'll be able to hear when I tap it lightly with a spoon the surface, which is pretty firm. In the meantime, what I've done is taken a little bit of heavy cream, hand whipped it till it's a little bit soft, slightly under whipped, added a little bit of sugar to it and a touch of a chocolate extract. And what I'll do is then float some of that on top of the brulee panna cotta, and that'll be our dessert. This is what it will look like when it's finished. And there you go. Alright, so let's take a little bit take a moment and try to hear the sound of that bruleed surface. And that is the crisp sugar layer on top. We're going to take some of the slightly under-whipped heavy cream. Get a nice portion of it on top. And just sort of spread that around. There we go, as simple as I can make it, given the limit on my ingredients. Chocolate espresso panna cotta with a bruleed surface and a little bit of slightly under-whipped heavy cream on top. It's delicious.